I'm very happy to be given this opportunity to present a brief introduction to the idea of optimal labour and birth. My first slide here is relating to some work that we did for the World Health Organization for their very recent antenatal care guidelines, where we were asked to find out what women want and need around the world. Not what they experienced in terms of labour and birth and pregnancy, but what they want and need. So we looked at all the world literature and every language on that was qualitative, and we found that there were basically there's one particular thing that women wanted, which was a positive pregnancy experience. And we also found that women didn't talk about pregnancy separately from birth and motherhood, which is why I'm giving you this information, because it also relates to birth. And you can see from the slide the aspects that women talked about. But what I particularly want to focus on is that they talked about an effective transition to positive labour and birth through their pregnancy, and the importance of achieving positive motherhood, which included these elements of autonomy and self-esteem. And the hierarchy that I've got here, the triangle, is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And you can see that at the bottom are the basic needs, safety and physical needs. And what the women were saying is that is the absolute minimum that we think a health service should provide. And if we click away the triangle, you can see that at the top of that are the other things that women particularly wanted, which were about psychosocial safety and self-fulfillment and self-esteem. And these were really important to women in this particular study, which was, as I say, all the literature in the world. So the next slide shows you how this is integrated into the guidelines, and the three things we deduced women needed from that. Primarily, they needed support. That was the most important thing that they said they needed in their pregnancies to help them to cope with the pregnancy and actually also labour and birth. They also wanted information, but not huge chunks of information. They wanted it as and when they needed it, in the format they needed it, at the time they needed it. And then, of course, they needed clinical care and therapeutic practices that were attuned to their cultural norms. We've now recently produced another review looking at the birth data, also for WHO, for their intrapartum guidelines, which are about to come out, which is where I am today, so I can't be with you. And you can see that there was a wide range of studies from 19 different countries, and what we concluded there is similar, that what women want most is a positive experience that fulfills or exceeds their prior personal and socio-cultural beliefs and expectations. And as you can see from the bullet points here, this did include, obviously, having a healthy baby and a healthy pregnancy and feeling physically well. That was the basic requirement. But it also, equally as much, was about practical and emotional support. Most women would prefer physiological labour and birth if it was possible for them to do so, but they also recognised the need to go with the flow. And if they wanted or needed interventions, it was important to them, very important, that they still had a sense of personal achievement at the end of the process through active decision making. And this work ties in with the Lancet series that came out recently that looked at this notion of too little, too late, too much, too soon. That is, if women don't have, and many countries they don't, the treatment they need as and when they need it, at the time they need it, then there's a risk of death and morbidity. But actually equally important in the Lancet series was women who had too much intervention were also traumatised in some cases by that. But anyway, they had outcomes that were not as good necessarily if that intervention was unnecessary intervention. And so in terms of a Lancet and now the whole world debates around this, those two things need to be held in balance for an optimal labour and birth. We did some work with women who had both a traumatic and a positive experience of labour and birth, and the words they used for the traumatic birth were words like horror and torture and hell. And you can see from this slide, the words they used about their positive birth were absolutely different. And you can see from the quote as well that actually having a positive birth was more than just being satisfied. It was something that was a completely life-changing experience. So this quote is just a quote from one of the women in the study, and I particularly like it because it talks about how these women still get a benefit from having had that really positive birth. It's not something that just happens once and goes away at the time of the birth. It resonates for a long time afterwards. And we know from data with fathers, this is also true for fathers and female partners of women. And the next slide is another example of a quote from a woman who had started off very marginalised and disadvantaged, but whose birth experience helped her to completely reorientate her life, to move ahead into the future with her family. And I'm also in this particular slide showing a quote from the New York Times from a father who was present at the home birth of his children. Doesn't have to be a home birth, could have been a good cesarean, but in this case it was a home birth. But the important thing here was that the effect on the father was also really important. Again, more than just the clinical outcome, although the clinical outcome's crucial. The world is looking at this notion of every woman, every child. For every woman and every child now, there's this idea of moving from just survival, which has been the focus of the global health community for a long time, into now thriving and transforming. And this fits with the new Sustainable Development Goals. Actually, we're not just about survival anymore. We are about moving into a new space of transformation. And again, this is a global move which is also important for optimal labour and birth in the UK. So I would suggest, if people are interested in today's meeting and in the future, to test out what we do against these criteria. Do any actions that we're going to put into place to deal with any particular issues in maternity service, if we take account of both the intended and unintended consequences in the short and long term, do they meet the criteria for both clinical safety and personalisation, as defined in this presentation by women, for all women and babies? And that's a really important thing for us to think about if we want to have optimal labour and birth. And basically the important thing is that optimal labour and birth should happen everywhere, all the time, for everyone.